I've been making videos defending you guys for a little over a year now, and in about the last 3 months or so, I'd say I've noticed a significant seismic shift in the energy, the vibes, and the cultural narrative surrounding Gen Z. In a drastically positive way, I might add. The slow pace of progress can be extremely frustrating. Believe me, I know. Sometimes it just feels like no matter how hard you try, nothing ever seems to change. And it's definitely tempting to just give up and fall back in nihilistic doomerism. But that's because when you're so focused on climbing up to the very peak of the mountain, you forget to look back and see just how far you've already come. So, I wanted to take this one video to do exactly that. Because one thing I've learned is that when you actually take a second to pause, catch your breath, and look back, that can give you a huge energy and motivational boost to keep pushing forward no matter how far away the peak may seem. In the last few months, I've seen you guys go from being called soft and lazy entitled snowflakes who can't handle the real world to literally burning down corrupt governments and toppling entire nations. I've seen the whole cultural narrative drastically shift to where almost everybody now universally agrees that boomers are the problem and not Gen Z. And last but not least, I've seen you go from being called nihilistic doomers with no purpose to a hungry, revolutionary generation demanding real change and solutions. This is how Gen Z is already starting to make incredible, amazing progress. Part 1. Everyone agrees boomers are the problem now. Once you can clearly write down a problem, the matter is already half resolved. This is Kydland's Law. I know you've already heard me quote this plenty of times on the channel, but I really can't overemphasize just how important it is to correctly diagnose the problem first if you want to find a true solution. I know the whole idea of taking personal responsibility and stop blaming others makes for a great alpha male motivational speech, but unfortunately, it's just not aligned with reality in most instances. Sometimes it's objectively just not your fault. If you randomly got struck by a lightning bolt one day and got paralyzed, it's straight up objectively just not your fault. If it's not something you should or could take personal responsibility for. If you were born to narcissistic, abusive boomer parents, something a lot of us have experienced, that's just straight up objectively not your fault. Period. And trying to work through it by taking personal responsibility for somebody else's mistakes is just a recipe for disaster. The economy got screwed over by forces completely out of your control, literally decades before you were even born. It is literally physically impossible for this to be your fault. You can't take personal responsibility for something that happened decades before you were even born. Okay, so you get the point by now. Sometimes things are just factually and objectively not your fault. And so taking personal responsibility for it is just a stupid feel-good motivational speech and not an actual solution. In order to get to the actual solution, you have to first correctly diagnose the actual problem. And it appears after months and months of cultural wars and battles, we've finally done exactly that. When I first started making videos about a year ago, the general cultural narrative was that Gen Z was the problem. Gen Z was the soft, weak, lazy, entitled generation. Y'all remember that. It wasn't that long ago. But now we finally flipped the script. Everyone from both sides of the political spectrum pretty much universally agrees now that boomers are the problem. We finally diagnosed the problem correctly, and this is the first step towards reaching an actual solution. Now you might be wondering, what? Really? How? Blaming someone else is the first step towards making progress? Actually, yes. People who have been stuck in narcissistic, abusive relationships will often tell you that the most common tactic the abuser uses is to gaslight you into believing everything is your fault. The first step towards breaking out of this cycle is to realize that no, it's actually not your fault. And our current modern-day society and economic structure is basically an abusive relationship on a macro mainstream level. You see, we have a select group of narcissists in power, and they've managed to convince everyone else that we are the problem and not them. But thanks to Gen Z passionately and persistently calling out the system and demanding real change, we are finally recognizing the real problem, ending this cycle of abuse, and beginning the process of healing for all of us. Hey guys, we set out on a mission during the summer to take down the biggest, most vile Gen Z hater, the Angry Guy, a straight up horrible human being who hates Gen Z so much he even celebrates them dying. Thanks to you, we've gained a ton of ground on him over the summer, and we've set a new goal to surpass him in subscribers and defeat him once and for all by the end of the year. So, if you're new here and enjoying this content, definitely consider subscribing and helping us take down the biggest, most evil, final boss Gen Z hater. With your help, we can absolutely do this. Part 2, the Gen Z protest rocking the world. Recently, I've spent a lot of time covering the Gen Z rebellion that's become nothing short of an international revolution now. This inspiring global movement has left every Gen Z hater in absolute shambles. Gone are the days of being labeled as soft entitled snowflakes who aren't ready for the real world. Nah, they're not ready for your version of the real world because you're the ones who created such a shitty ass real world to live in. But while they're not ready for your shitty real world, they're certainly ready to burn it all down and create their own new, better real world to live in. And that's exactly what these international global Gen Z protests have shown. But let's back up a bit and revisit what we talked about in part 1, which is correctly identifying and diagnosing the problem. You see, these revolutionary protests can only happen if, and only if, we recognize who the actual problem is. For a long time, Gen Z was just depressed and nihilistic sitting at home, but that's because they were being lied to and manipulated into believing that they were the problem. It's your fault you can't get a job. You should have studied more. It's your fault you can't pay rent. You just need to work harder. All this BS gaslighting may have worked on previous generations, but when it comes to Gen Z, what they didn't realize is that there is a major flip side to this equation as well. You see, Gen Z, being the social media generation, has the ability to spread information and mobilize like never before. You see, when I was a young and naive 18-year-old who couldn't get a job, I too was lied to and manipulated into believing it was my fault. Social media was still in its very early days, and I just didn't have many like-minded people with shared experiences to connect with. And as a result, I felt like I was all alone in the struggle. This, by the way, is another classic narcissistic abuser tactic. Isolate your prey, make them feel all alone. Because when they start reaching out and realizing that many other people feel the exact same way, that's when they realize it is not their fault, that the system is a BS rigged game, and that millions of other people feel the same way, and they're ready to call you out on your crap. The end result has been a spectacular destruction of an outdated system that's no longer working. But it all began with realizing that it's the system and not you that's the failure here. Then sharing your experience with others on social media who have seen the exact same thing. Eventually, your message begins to spread like a raging wildfire and manifest in the global revolution we are witnessing right now as we speak. Part 3, the progress. So, you might be watching this video and thinking, well, this is all cool and everything, but what has it actually accomplished from a practical standpoint? Well, quite a lot actually. Earlier this year, Iceland moved to officially implement a 4-day work week when they saw how brutally effective and efficient it was. It began as a 4-year experiment where 90% of the workforce got an extra day off without decreased pay whatsoever. The result was a wild success beyond anyone's imagination. Massive boost in mental health, significant reduction in stress, better work-life balance, and positive impact on employee well-being. But this is all to be expected, right? I mean, work is inherently miserable for most people, and so working less would of course produce that outcome. What was unexpected, however, was that productivity actually remained stable despite the fewer working hours. Yes, even productivity, aka work itself. It turns out that although people worked much less, the extra time off allowed them to be more focused and do their jobs better in the fewer hours they did work. Quality over quantity. And we all know this to be true even just through common sense and personal experience. When you're working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, you're just way too burned out to care by the end of it. Gen Z was such an integral force in pushing through the 4-day work week in Iceland that all the articles covering it have explicitly stated all the predictions made by Generation Z have come true. Iceland's experience shows that the 4-day workweek is not only viable, but can also bring significant benefits for both workers and society as a whole. By putting the well-being of individuals at the heart of its priorities, Iceland has created a more humane and sustainable working model, which could inspire other countries to follow in its example. By championing this cause, Gen Z has helped to pave the way for a future where work adapts to people's needs rather than the other way around. Iceland's success proves that their predictions were far from utopia, and that a profound change in our relationship with work is not only possible, but desirable. In Madagascar, the Gen Z protests we've been talking about have literally toppled the government. I'm talking literally, not figure of speech. The president of Madagascar was actually overthrown by a military coup, and he has now had to go into hiding. In North Africa, young Moroccans have coalesced under the banner of the Gen Z 212 movement, named after the nation's international dialing code. They are critical of the Moroccan government's priorities, faulting authorities for investments in sports infrastructure, which they say overshadow healthcare and education. Recent demonstrations have led to deadly confrontations and reports of police violence. In East Africa, Kenya witnessed protests stemming from a contentious finance bill that raised taxes during a cost of living crisis. These grievances have morphed into calls for regime change, with numerous fatalities reported. Kingsley Moghalu, a former presidential candidate from Nigeria and public policy expert, told CNN that these movements signify a growing consciousness among young people of their political power. Moghalu warns that underperforming African leaders should be very wary. This article also highlights something I touched on earlier, which is that Gen Z social media savviness has led to an unprecedented ability to organize, mobilize, and end this broken, abusive system. The article says, and I quote, "Although the protests differ in their specific causes, they share one common characteristic. They are primarily led by Generation Z, who are voicing their dissatisfaction with their governments. Technology is also a common feature of the protests, which are organized and mobilized through social media." Conclusion. So, if you follow my channel, you'll know that I'm generally quite a doomer. Well, not necessarily a doomer. I more consider myself a realist, and I'm simply acknowledging the reality that the world is pretty doom and gloom right now, objectively speaking. I'm as far from a blissfully hopeful optimist as you can get. So, if I'm feeling a bit of hopium, there's definitely something to it. And I can definitely say that right now, going into 2026, I can definitely feel something brewing right here. We've had protests, rallies, and movements in the past. None of them really ended up making a lasting practical impact. But this time, it just feels different. We're not simply electing another leader, replacing one corrupt politician with another anymore. We're literally overthrowing them and installing new governments that promise to work for us. We're done with their BS rigged games, their broken promises, and constant moving of the goalposts. Work harder only for you to see your living expenses rise way faster than whatever bullshit pay raise you get. Study hard and go to college, only to be saddled with a bunch of student loan debt without any job prospects when you graduate anyways. For a bunch of people who constantly preach on about personal responsibility, they sure as hell never take any accountability or responsibility themselves. It's never their responsibility to fix the broken system that they themselves ruin. It's never their responsibility to create a better world and future for the next generation. It's never their responsibility to clean up their own mess that they themselves created long before Gen Z was even born. Nah, somehow they've convinced all of us that all the insane problems going on in the world right now are somehow the fault of a bunch of 18 to 25-year-olds who literally just became adults, who are barely old enough to even vote, let alone occupy positions of power and have any real tangible impact on public policy. Typical narcissist abuse, but on a macro societal level. Gaslighting, blame shifting, scapegoating, and a total refusal to take any accountability whatsoever. But here's the good news. The beginning of breaking any abusive cycle starts by first recognizing what it is and collectively mobilizing against it. And that's what Gen Z has done beautifully in the last few months or so. 2026 is right around the corner, and I'm going to go ahead and make a bold prediction for the new year. Based on these recent events, I'm predicting that 2026 is going to be a huge year for progress for Gen Z. Mostly because Gen Z is literally forcing the issue right now, and nobody can stop them anymore. It's obvious that this current system is totally broken and outdated, and we're going to need some kind of newer, better one. Something has to give here. We can't go on continuing to pay $2,000 a month in rent while wages remain the same dog shit they've always been. There may be some pain in the transition period, as we're seeing with the worldwide Gen Z protests right now, but I've never been more hopeful that change and progress is on the way, and I couldn't be more proud of Gen Z for igniting this movement that's sure to go down in the history books. So, we finally correctly diagnosed the actual problems in this video. But if you want to talk about actual serious solutions, check out this video right here, where I talk about what I would personally do for Gen Z if I were to be elected president. Thanks for watching. I'll see you there.